I now have the pleasure of introducing the second half of this act, who is Robert Ousterhout, who teaches Byzantine art and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the Center for Ancient Studies. He taught previously at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign from 1983 to 2006, where he received his PhD in 1982. He also directs a summer site seminar for graduate students in Cappadocia for Koç University. He's the former president of the U.S. National Committee for Byzantine Studies and former president of Byzantine Studies Association of North America. And his research and publications focus on the documentation and interpretation of vanishing architectural heritage of the Eastern Mediterranean. He is currently fellow in residence at Dumbarton Oaks, where he's preparing a new study of Byzantine Cappadocia. And I should say he is author and co-author of 13 books and of 12 edited or co-edited books, including the now classic Master Builder of Byzantium. And he will speak to us on From Hagia Sophia to Ayasofya, Architecture and the Persistence of Memory. And welcome, Bob.
Thank you, Eva, and thank all of you for sticking it out to the bitter end. It's wonderful to be teamed up with Dee Dee again. We used to think of ourselves as the Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland of Champaign-Urbana. We can put on a show. So, Istanbul only officially became Istanbul in 1930. Before then, it answered to many names, but for much of the Western world, it remained Constantinople, legendary capital of a vanished empire, entrepot of the East, and so on. For the educated traveler schooled in the classics, Constantinople was the last great ancient city, albeit a bit down in the heel and overlaid with an Oriental veneer. During the waning years of the Ottoman Empire, it represented a brash alternative to the contemporary urban situation, with what European tourists saw as decline and decadence on all sides. If the archaeologists could only sweep away that veneer, they imagined, the vestiges of a glorious past would reappear, as they had decades earlier in Athens, testimony of an all but forgotten civilization uniquely responsible for preserving and transmitting the culture of Greco-Roman antiquity. Byzantium represented the continuity of the ancient Greco-Roman tradition and thus merited study. Moreover, it was a Christian past, and that mattered greatly to a Christian Europe, which still viewed the Muslim world with suspicion. Shaped by attitudes of European imperialism of the 18th and 19th century, they saw the Ottoman Empire as decadent, irrational, and bellicose. In contrast, Byzantine Constantinople had, quote, defended the higher life of mankind against the attacks of formidable antagonists and rendered eminent service to the cause of human welfare, unquote, as Alexander Van Milligan wrote in 1899. He continues, this is what gives the archaeological study of the city its dignity and importance, end quote. That is, the past, waiting to be unearthed, represented something entirely different from the present reality. It was not something that could provide validation or symbolic underpinnings for the current regime. Unlike other nations and capitals, which had used the past to forge a modern identity, the pre-Ottoman past of Constantinople stood in dramatic opposition to the present, doubly tainted by its Hellenism and by its Christianity. This curious past offered no symbolic capital to the Ottomans. It could only serve to empower the present regime by remaining conquered. That is, if its churches continued to function as mosques and its spaces of power remained unexplored. Still today in Istanbul, it constitutes a radical political statement to call the city Constantinople. Well, Byzantinists like myself are accustomed to being politically incorrect, to finding our religious monuments transformed into mosques, and to dealing with all the challenges that come with a messy afterlife. In writing Byzantine architectural history, later transformations, accretions, and altered meanings must be balanced against a narrow period focus and incorporated into a larger historical view. Buildings are forever in the process of becoming, and to fix them at their moment of conception severely limits what we might learn from them. Working a decade ago on the restoration of the Arab Jame in Istanbul, that is, the 12th century monastery of Christ Pantocrator, our theoretical discussions often boil down to something very basic, like what kind of cornices should be restored in areas where they were missing, Byzantine, Ottoman, Republican. It would have been considerably easier to simply restore the building to its 12th century Byzantine form. But if we're going to understand the building as the sum of its history, we couldn't just sweep away its disparate accretions, but how to reconcile the jarring historical juxtapositions? And could we still privilege the Byzantine past when the building had a long Ottoman history and continues to function as a mosque? Difficult questions indeed. Historical circumstances provided an easy answer. Following George W. Bush's visit to the NATO meeting in Istanbul in 2004, our permit was revoked, we were asked to leave, and the project was given to a good Muslim contractor from the municipality. Now, our sort of longue durée approach represented a relatively new ecumenical attitude toward archaeology and historic preservation, very much in contrast with the attitudes of the preceding centuries, as, for example, what occurred in the fervor of nationalism within modern Greece. In early 20th century Thessaloniki, all Ottoman transformations were undone, so that many of the Byzantine churches retain no vestige of their Ottoman history. Many buildings are almost unrecognizable in their pre-restoration states, as Holy Apostles seen here, or Hagia Sophia seen here. At the Hagia Sophia, the past was so effectively erased that scholars subsequently interpreted the base of its minaret as the remnant of the Byzantine belfry. Now, one of the very basic realizations I had while working at the Arab Jame is that Byzantine churches don't make very good mosques, at least from a purely functional perspective. After the 6th century, most Byzantine churches were private, oriented to small congregations and private devotions, so that plans are characterized by their complexity rather than their monumentality, with the subdivision of space rather than the unity of space, with subsidiary chapels, narthexes, and ambulatories to address the increasingly intricate nature of Byzantine devotions. In Ottoman transformations of buildings like the Fenari Isa Jame, the former monastery of Lips, walls and even columns were removed in an attempt to unify the space for congregational worship. Add into the mix the shift of focus from due east toward Mecca, and you have a recipe for complexity and contradiction. The Fethiye Jame in Istanbul, for example, is so transformed that the Byzantinists still puzzle over its construction history. The motivation for conversion was never simply functional. Now, for the early Ottomans, the conversion of churches was part of the symbolic appropriation of the land. Domination and the Islamic present were expressed by the standard practice of transforming the main church of a conquered city into a mosque, as, for example, the Ayasofya Jame at Iznik. At Bursa, which was conquered in 1326, intriguingly, we have no record of a cathedral converted to a mosque, but 2 churches were appropriated as the mausolea of Osman and Orhan. Both were destroyed by earthquake in the 19th century, but are known from drawings. So the conversion of Byzantine churches to house the tombs of the founders of the Ottoman dynasty is an act I find redolent with meaning, as has recently been discussed by Suna Chabtai. Now, the functional appropriation of important Byzantine buildings was symbolically significant and would have been clearly understood by the contemporary viewer, whether Christian or Muslim. In most instances, the physical transformation was minimal, often without the immediate destruction of the figural decoration. A minaret would have been added on the exterior, a mihrab and other necessary furnishings on the interior, giving the building a sort of transitional appearance, at once identifiable as both a church and mosque. And while serving the needs of the faithful, the building would have also stood symbolically as a monument of conquest and domination. Now, what is important was the recognition that the building used to be a Christian church, but was no longer. Now, initially, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and other converted buildings, much of the original interior decoration was left intact, although the visibly Christian elements were understood differently by later, more religiously conservative generations under which they were removed. Much of the figural decoration was subsequently uncovered by the Fossati brothers in the mid-19th century at Hagia Sophia, but they were covered up again in response to religious sentiments as they were deemed inappropriate for a mosque. But as everyone knows, here at least knows, Mehmet the Conqueror converted the church of Hagia Sophia to a mosque as one of his first official acts following the conquest of Constantinople, and it was clearly a symbolic act. The conversion involved minimal physical transformation, and even its name remained the same, Ayasofya Jame in Turkish. As appropriated, however, the scale and evocative power of the building cried out for a symbolic reading. Now, two aspects of the conversion of Hagia Sophia from a church to a mosque are important for our discussion. First, it was necessary to create an Islamic text and an Ottoman legend for Hagia Sophia. Borrowing from Byzantine accounts, Ottoman historians interwove history and myth to situate Hagia Sophia in an Ottoman present and to justify its conversion into a royal mosque, as Stefan Gerasimos and Gülru Necipoglu have discussed. Thus, according to one version, when the half-dome over the apse collapsed on the night of the Prophet Muhammad's birth, it could only be repaired with a mortar composed of sand from Mecca, water from the well of Zemzem, and the Prophet's saliva. In addition, Muslim and Ottoman symbols were introduced into Hagia Sophia, including the first minaret, the mihrab, and other mosque furnishings, as well as sacred relics and battle trophies. Now, half a millennium later, Ataturk performed a similar symbolic transformation. As he secularized the Turkish state, he secularized Hagia Sophia following the foundation of the Republic. On the 24th of November, 1934, the same day that Gazi Kemal was proclaimed Ataturk, the Turkish Council of Ministers decreed that the building should be turned into a museum. And the proclamation reads, "Due to its historical circumstance, the conversion of Ayasofya Mosque, a unique architectural monument of art located in Istanbul, into a museum will please the entire Eastern world, and its conversion to a museum will cause humanity to gain a new institution of knowledge." Now, Thomas Whittemore, who had befriended Ataturk and had gained permission already in 1931 for the uncovering, had gained permission already in 1931 for the uncovering of the mosaics. And as Whittemore embellished his story, he wrote, "Santa Sophia was a mosque the day I talked to him. The next day I went to the mosque and there was a sign on the door written in Ataturk's own hand. It said, 'The museum is closed for repairs.'" Well, let's see. Certainly the secularization fit within the context of Ataturk's political vision and the civilizing mission to reshape modern Turkey as a part of Western civilization. All the same, there had been regular and repeated calls for reopening Hagia Sophia as a church for much of the previous half-century. An 1877 article in the New York Times began, "How soon the crescent over the minarets of St. Sophia will be replaced by the cross, or how soon the minarets themselves will be swept away, leaving the outlines of the church in their ancient condition, no seer has foretold." An 1912 article in the same newspaper predicted that the Bulgarians, advancing on the Ottoman capital, would soon plant the cross on top of St. Sophia. A decade later, the Greek Megali Ivea had the conversion of Hagia Sophia as one of its top priorities. In 1921, a special service was held in St. John the Divine in New York, with Orthodox and Episcopal clergy praying together in 6 languages for the restoration of Hagia Sophia as a Christian sanctuary. Throughout the early 20th century, almost all Western commentators expressed the same wish, while to them, Hagia Sophia's continued functioning as an Ottoman mosque represented no better than a desecration. So one wonders if Ataturk's secularization of the building came as something of a compromise, a defensive strategy when faced with the unified desires of a very Christian West. Of course, the debate continues. Barely 1 year ago, the Ayasofya in Iznik was reopened as a mosque. Originally a church and the setting of one of the most important early church councils, the building had been converted to a mosque with the Ottoman conversion of Bithynia and subsequently re-outfitted by Sinan. It had fallen into disrepair long before the foundation of the Republic and had stood as a roofless ruin. For decades, it has functioned as a museum and had recently begun to attract Christian pilgrims. Then, Deputy Prime Minister Bülent Arınç found a loophole in the law, insisting that the building had never officially been a museum, and that allowed its conversion to a mosque. Reaction has been predictable. Academics and secularists have decried the move, which they see as setting a dangerous precedent. Islamists are delighted, as one local commented, and high time too. Next, I want to see it happen to Ayasofya in Istanbul. In fact, the Byzantine antiquities of the building are being protected, even better than before. Still, locals expect tourism to decline, even though admission fees are no longer charged. The reconversion of Ayasofya has spurred efforts for the reconversion of others. Arınç is now calling for the reconversion of Hagia Sophia in Trebizond, and last May, thousands of devout Muslims, organized by the Anatolian Youth Organization, prayed outside the Istanbul monument, shouting, "Break the chains, let Ayasofya Mosque open." As their leader explained, keeping Ayasofya Mosque closed is an insult to our mostly Muslim population of 75 million. It symbolizes our ill treatment by the West. He continued, "As the grandchildren of Mehmet the Conqueror, seeking the reopening of Ayasofya as a mosque is our legitimate right." Meanwhile, the Free Hagia Sophia Council of America continues to lobby the US Congress to support the reopening of Hagia Sophia as an Orthodox church, even after their failed attempt in 2010 to conduct a liturgy inside the building. In short, the building has accrued meanings that have nothing to do with its physical form and quite possibly very little to do with its history. Deconstruct this image. Proponents on both sides of the debate employ cultural memory selectively. As with both of its historic conversions, the symbolic implications far outweigh the functional. Now, another recent event is noteworthy in this context. The Arab Jame, originally the 14th century Dominican church in Galata, suffered minor damage in the 1999 earthquake, after which plaster began to fall from the vaults, revealing remnants of its original decoration. The unique frescoes and mosaics elucidate the close working relationships between Byzantine and Italian artisans in the late Byzantine period. The title of the article here is The Renaissance Begins in Istanbul. Sadly, although the paintings were uncovered and conserved last year, the Vakıflar decided to cover them up again. They are no longer visible, and while we anxiously await their full publication, the episode reminds us just how far we have come, or not, since the Fossati's restoration of Hagia Sophia. Let me end with a conversion that mercifully didn't happen. During the Balkan Wars, Bulgarian forces moved into Macedonia and Thrace, finally taking Edirne on the 26th of March, 1913, after a protracted siege. Although they held the city only briefly, withdrawing in July of the same year, the Bulgarians saw their presence in Odrin as permanent, and the Tsaritsa Eleanor came to visit barely a week after the conquest. Professor Bogdan Filov, who was one of the several archaeological researchers traveling with the Bulgarian army, left this note, which accompanies his photographs from that time. He wrote, "On our arrival in Odrin, we met the Queen. She told us that a committee had been established in Sofia, whose wish had been to turn the Mosque of Sultan Selim into a church. She, of course, opposed this and expected us to support her." It's shocking, perhaps, to imagine one of our signature monuments of Islamic architecture functioning as a church, although I hasten to note we Byzantinists have been doing the opposite, like, forever. In any event, we should be all grateful to Queen Eleanor for her insight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. So we are going to have our questions with our pair of speakers, and please come up to the microphone with your question. And actually, right before we have the questions, I just want to remind you of my announcement about the invitation of membership to the International Center for Medieval Art. Larry Neese, the president of the International Center for Medieval Art, is here with, and there he is, and he has information for you on this. And okay, any questions, please?
Hey, Dee Dee. So when Dan, are you here, Dan? When Dan and I worked on Al-Andalus 20 years ago, the people that we were working with in Spain were in full golden age mode, right? You know, the 12th century in Toledo was a kumbaya moment. It was convivencia in all of its awful, gaudy, saturated color. And even in Cordoba, the younger clergy were into it. It was a cultural moment, spurred, I think, also by the fact that it was an economically good moment, spurred by the excitement of participation in a European moment. So I, too, have noticed that there's a kind of backtracking, and because the religious dialogue is always subordinated to the national dialogue, you can embrace a palace. But in the church, there's a kind of backtracking, which has to do with the fact, of course, the church has become, even in those 20 years, much less powerful. But do you see the present economic situation in Spain and the present immigration in Spain having something to do with this?
Is this one on? Okay, yeah. I mean, I absolutely think that you have to think of this in contemporary political framework. So it is the pressure of new immigration and also the pressure post-Franco of Spaniards themselves choosing to shed the bonds of Franco-style Catholicism by reclaiming, an Islamic identity that has been dormant, for them for, I don't know how long. Talking about 500, 600 years. I mean, who knows how long. So, and what pushes it is not only this demographic change, but also that new and increasingly empowered community actually actively asking to perform prayer in the mosque. And I think that's what really sets off the panic. Because, anyone can go in there and pray any old way they want. But Muslim prayer is a performance. It is highly visible, and it claims space in a way that someone just sitting quietly on a bench and saying whatever they want to in their mind, it's very different. And it's that performance of prayer that is absolutely setting off a panic. And one of the images one of my images was of, multiple sort of moments in identity, and there's a guy there who's kneeling, and he's praying outside the mosque because it's a famous picture, they won't let him in to pray. So yeah, I mean, I think this is not an argument I would have made 50 years ago. You didn't, first of all, Franco wouldn't let any of this happen, but it is something that's happening now because of this, it's also, I'll stop in a minute and let someone else talk, but it's also a pressure that is, it's the same kind of anxiety we feel about immigration, right? What do you do, no matter how liberal you are, what do you do about, impoverished immigrants? It's a tax burden. Well, that's what's happening is they're looking at, and many, many, many of them are coming from North Africa. And honestly, when, the year I was on sabbatic, every month there was a story of immigrants trying to float across and dying on the beaches of southern Spain, and it was horrific. So it's, it's dramatic.
Yeah, I think we see something very similar going on, but with kind of different reasons. But there is a political agenda here. And in part, going back to Didi's opening remarks, a lot of it is about creating a national identity and the role of religion in a national identity, which sits uneasily in Spain. In Turkey, which is now predominantly Muslim, one would think that this should not be such a prominent issue on the agenda. And for example, the people in Trabzon seem to be against the conversion of Ayasofya into a mosque. There was an element of dissent in Iznik when this happened. They see that there is a part of the population that is willing to embrace a heterogeneous past, but a heterogeneous past sits very uncomfortably in a nationalist present.
Thank you very much for your papers. They were really fascinating. I was wondering, you talked about the church to mosque and mosque to church, but then also in the 20th century, the museumification for the nation of these spaces. And I was wondering if you saw that 20th century phenomenon as a third mode of a belief system, or if you saw that belief system in either the Muslim or the Christian tradition.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And thinking of it that way, when you think about it, if you're going to embrace a religion, you usually go to the extreme when you embrace the religion. You rarely say, I'm going to become a Unitarian. I found faith, I'm going to become a Unitarian. So transforming a building that has such meaning associated with it historically, and because of its architectural presence, really sort of demands a symbolic reading, to say, oh, it's going to be a museum, really takes it out of that context of a building that has meaning within society. So I think within the early republic in Turkey, it made a great deal of sense. I like to think that museums have a role in our society, but where do museums fit within a nationalist agenda? That I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just add, I was very hard on Spanish politicians, unfairly so. One of the beautiful things about the Mosque of Cordoba Cathedral of Cordoba is there are these two actually areas of exhibition that are foregrounding a past that is uncomfortable except in a kind of scholarly museological sense. So it's sort of like saying, okay, well, there is this Islamic past, but let's just remember it's happening in a church. So it is that third course that you talked about.
Thank you both for really magnificent papers. I have one question for Bob, and it's actually building on your question, and that's actually the fourth layer of Hagia Sophia, because now they do call to prayer from the minarets, and they've carved out a mosque space. on the Topkapi side of the museum. So we've got now even another layer of reconversion and incrustation of a new Islamic space onto the museum. And I'm wondering, with this incredible acceleration of conversions of churches to mosques these days, including in the eastern frontiers, where you see now kilise jamis, right, church mosques, as they're called, how you interpret that in the AK Party platform and this recrudescence of neo-Ottomanism, because it seems to be really interconnected with the AK Party's larger program.
I think there's a lot of political muscle flexing going on. One of my last days before we were thrown out of the Arab Jame, I was on the scaffolding, and one of the local people stopped to chat. And his question to me, as always, are you a Muslim or not? And I said, I'm a historian, a researcher, a restoration. I wish to preserve this very important jami. I even called it a mosque. And he simply wouldn't give it up. Are you a Muslim or not? Because he insisted that it was inappropriate for non-Muslims to be working on the conservation of a mosque. I stopped short of pointing him out the history of most Ottoman mosque construction and the makeup of the workforce. But there was something there that, I mean, it really struck a chord. And one of the things I find is that there is, with this move for reconversion, there is a sort of willful ignorance, as you know, there is in most countries like the American voting public. But the willful ignorance there is to not engage with what is a very rich and colorful past, and to see where we are now in the 21st century in relationship to what has come before. For the AK Party, and you have to realize that, you know, Erdogan is a former professional football player. You know, he is, you know, hasn't gone to Harvard Law. He is not coming out of a background where he has a great deal of culture, and he's surrounded himself by people like him who have street smarts, who are very good at sorting out the economy, but there is a very basic understanding of what culture is. And I think this is best represented by the fact that the cultural ministry was combined with the tourism ministry, which is to say, culture, as it is defined, is something that is part of tourism. It's something that the foreigners are interested in, but perhaps not us. I could go on, but I'll stop there.
You sort of started talking about what I wanted to ask. Thanks, these are really fascinating papers. But what I'm interested in is how these monuments become meaningful beyond the national, that is, in the international context. And both of the monuments that you talked about today have these resonances that have been very much in the news. I was struck, Bob, by the image of Ayasofya shorn of its minarets with a cross on top by Americans for Ayasofya, is that what you said? And then, of course, Cordoba became this big newsworthy monument when Newt Gingrich started talking about how it was a symbol of Islamic conquest with the discussion of the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, Cordoba House. And I wondered if both of you could talk about the ways in which these monuments have become icons of the so-called clash of civilizations, and why that is, that particularly people in the United States would look at these monuments that have such complex and layered meanings in this very polarized way.
I will begin with an anecdote that has nothing to do with these buildings, but when Melina Mercury was Minister of Culture for Greece and was calling for the return of the Parthenon marbles, she made a dramatic appearance in the British Museum. She saw the marbles, fell to her knees, weeping, and said, the past, something very profound that I forget, the past of the country lies broken or something, and had to be told by the reporters who were covering her visit that she was in the wrong room. She was actually in front of the remains from Xanthos, which is in Turkey. And being the consummate actress, she went into the proper room and in front of the proper Parthenon marbles performed her tearful ode again. Which is to say that the actual physical form of the monument was only secondary to the political meanings that it had accrued, where somebody who has based her career on those objects could mistake them when she is in front of them. And I think this is the case with many of these monuments in these complex societies, that they accrue meanings that have very, very little to do with what was intended from at the beginning.